My name is Dr.G. Welcome to That's Unusual, my podcast uncovering the unusual stories behind the world's most interesting people. On this show, we celebrate what makes us different and how we convert those differences into unexpected opportunities. Welcome to That's Unusual. My guest today is Daniel Walker, a good friend and someone I admire immensely for his willingness to challenge the status quo and think beyond business as usual. Although you may not have heard his name in the public eye, he was the driving force behind the growth of Gap, Apple, and many other household brands. As the Chief Talent Officer, he worked directly with Steve Jobs during the Apple turnaround days and has been critical to the rapid rise of Apple with its iPod and smartphone releases, as well as its novel retail operation. His unconventional approach to identifying, managing, and growing talent has been the envy of many leaders and organizations, often imitated but seldom duplicated. His techniques for catalyzing change have been studied across organizations looking to cope with rapid shifts in the marketplace. He has enough unusual stories to last a lifetime. In this episode, we cover just a few of those that include how his military background influenced his signature talent development approach, his unusual rise to the top as an executive leader for numerous premier brands, and personal, never-before-told stories of working directly with Steve Jobs. He shares what really happened behind the scenes, despite what the media likes to claim. As you listen to this episode, I ask that you reflect on your own unusual stories and unique qualities that can help open doors to unexpected opportunities. And so with that, let's get started. I'm extremely excited with today's show. I have on with me as my guest today, Dan Walker. Welcome to the show, Daniel Walker.
Thanks, Gotham.
Now, I don't even know where to begin with you. I'm so excited because you have so many interesting stories to share, probably not enough to fit and squeeze into a 30-minute podcast, but we'll see what we can capture here today. You're an individual who has seen it all. I mean, you've had such a decorated career serving, starting off in the military, working your way through various HR stints through Gap and Apple and JCPenny and a number of others. And we'll get to all of that information because you've got certainly a lot of great nuggets and lessons to share for our listening audience from there. But I think to start it all off, I think what would be great is if you could tell us, who is Dan? How did you get started? What was your upbringing? What were your biggest influences? And how did you get started on sort of the career that you've sort of launched into?
Well, if you've ever seen that wonderful comedy, The Jerk, I'm a little like the character in The Jerk, only hopefully more intelligent. And my launch into the world was a little less bumpy than his. But I'm from the Midwest. I'm truly a Midwestern child. Family originally from Southeast Ohio, Appalachia, and Columbus, Ohio is my home of record. Even though I was born in a little town about 2 miles from the Ohio River. And I grew up in a very large family with a mother and father who were, if they aspired greatly, you could call blue collar. My mother spent her life raising her children, and my father was an electrician in a world where sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. So we were very, very poor. And, the old saying, the proverbial pot to urinate in and a window to throw it out that some don't have. Well, we had the window, but often didn't have the pot. And so I spent part of my early childhood actually eating government commodity food because that's the best we could do. And so I came from nothing. But that didn't hold me back. I always found passion in everything that I did. And my mother instilled in me, and actually all of the kids, I could see it in their lives, the desire and the need to at least do your best and to be decent and kind and to always, at the end of the day, know that you did as well as you could. And the next day, get up, make sure that you're clean, She was actually she was a master at checking our ears before we'd go out the door. Can you imagine all these little kids, 5 boys and 2 girls, lined up at the door with her checking first one ear for all of us, and then we'd have to line up again, and she'd get on the other side and check the other ears. And I had.
And you had how many brothers and sisters?
4 brothers. I had 5. One passed away at an early age, and 2 sisters. And so it was a lively household, filled with a lot of love and a lot of laughter. But, poverty brings a pain with it, no matter how wonderful your parents might be. And but, that never got in the way. And so I would say that we lived in a very tough neighborhood. By the way, I learned to fight at a very young age because I was actually good at school, and that wasn't in vogue back then. And so what would happen? I had to walk about 8 blocks to get to my elementary school, and the way there was fine because nobody wants to fight in the morning. But on the way home, they always wanted to pick on the teacher's pet, and I was only the teacher's pet because I was the one who paid attention and actually studied and learned and showed interest. And so I actually became quite a fighter and went on to start boxing when I was 12 years old at the local boys club, and boxed for another 5 years. So, but it was learned on the way to and from school as the so-called teacher's pet.
How did that sense of adversity and sort of that fighting attitude, how did you essentially make your way out of, that world that you were reared in into sort of what launched a very successful career for you?
I told somebody yesterday, it's ironic that we're talking about this today. I've actually never, ever started a fight, and I have never, ever backed down from one, and I've never lost one. And to me, fighting for what's right and fighting for what you want is very, very important, provided that you do it with a great set of fundamental principles. If you're a good person and if you had good values, then get on with the fight. And so I've never once worried about making waves or worried about angering people when I was doing something that I knew was right. And so that's really been the theme throughout my entire career. And that's why I never shied away from taking a path that nobody else wants to take because it appears too dangerous or too politically reckless. And so I would just do what I thought was most intelligent and right. And I was intrepid about it. And but that was instilled in me at a very young age. So I, as you know, I was very reluctant to enter the world of business because I always saw it as kind of this mysterious place where people, had lunches and did paperwork and talked on the phone. And it never occurred to me through my entire childhood and actually early adulthood that I would ever end up doing that for a living. And so I fell into, as many people do, my career quite by accident, only because it's the only job I could get.
And what was that job?
Well, I came out of college, and just as I'm sure some of your listeners hopefully will have had a chance to look at my bio. Out of high school, I went directly into the Army because I knew I was going to be drafted. It was that time. It was 1967, and everybody who was going to turn 18, who turned 18 and didn't have a deferment of some kind or disqualification from the military, you were going to be drafted. Everybody. And there was no lottery. And the Vietnam War was at its height. And so I just assumed that I was going to go into the military because I was a good student, but not a great student. And nobody gave scholarships to people from my school. I went to an inner city school. And I was a good athlete, but not good enough to get a scholarship at a university. And so I thought I would beat everybody to the punch in the military, and I'd really pull one over on them. And I enlisted not for 3 years, which was the standard in the Army, 2 years for the draft, 3 years if you enlisted. But I fell hook, line, and sinker for a story from an Army recruiter and joined what turned out to be an incredibly wonderful group called the Army Security Agency. But I enlisted for 4 years, not knowing what I was going to do, where I was going to do it. And since it was highly classified, we were a division of the National Security Agency. I wasn't even allowed to tell people what I did. And yes, that does happen in the real world. When you have a top secret crypto security clearance, you have to keep your mouth shut. And so I went off to the Army for 4 years and spent all of my time, with the exception of my months of training before I left, in the Far East. And really, as a kid from the center of Columbus, Ohio, to go to the Far East and travel throughout the Far East for over 3 years was quite an adventure. When I got out, I went immediately to college. I always knew I was going to go to college, and we happened to have, one of the finest institutions in America, the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. And so I enrolled, and I was a liberal arts major, undeclared, and decided that I would become a psychology major. And I did that simply because it sounded interesting. I didn't know what I would do with it, but it certainly didn't seem like it would harm me. And I thought, I'll figure it out when the time comes. And I loved it. I worked all the way through. I was already a father. I was married at 17 at a very young age. Wow. To my high school sweetheart, my first girlfriend. And I was a father when I was 19. My first son, Dan Jr., was born. So I really was motivated to do well in school because I had a reason to do that beyond any personal ambition that I had. So I graduated with honors, but I graduated in 1974. I graduated early because I received some credit for being in the military. And I also had taken some correspondence courses during my 4 years. And so I really started in my sophomore year. So I graduated in 74, and you're young enough that you'd have to remember this from literature that you've read. 1974 might have been the worst job market year in history. There were no jobs, specifically no jobs for liberal arts majors with psychology degrees. And so I interviewed with everybody. And I actually wanted to go to grad school, but I would have gone to grad school for psychology. But Ohio State had a history of never taking any of their undergrads for their graduate program in psychology. So I knew that was out, and I couldn't move. And so I was looking for a job, and I looked at everything. And of course, everybody said no to me. IBM, American Hospital Supply, Xerox, you name it. And I thought, this is actually going to be easy before I started the process, because I was an honors graduate from Ohio State. I was a military veteran. I was married with a child. I was stable. And I thought, they're going to like me. Well, they liked me, but not enough to give me a job. So what happened was I was ready to go back into the military. I had secretly wanted to do that anyway, or to go back to work for the National Security Agency. And I had offers from both. And but my wife wanted nothing to do with that. So she would clip advertisements from the newspaper because that's the way you got a job back then. They ran classified ads. And she said, just go on a few more job interviews, because I'd been on dozens, maybe hundreds. Take a few more before you throw the towel in. And so I said, okay, honey, whatever. Just give me the ads and I'll go. And so one of them was for the local department store. Every big Midwestern city had its department store. Well, the department store in Columbus, Ohio, was the grand dam of Federated Department Stores, Lazarus, the family that founded Federated Department Stores. It was one of the classic, big downtown stores. It covered 8 square city blocks, 6 floors above ground, 3 below ground. And I had, I couldn't afford to shop there as a child, but it was this looming, incredible edifice for the city. So I applied for a job as a compensation manager. Now, I had no idea what it was. And so I applied for the job. I went in, I dropped off my resume, and of course, they had their application. I filled that out. I'm sitting in a room full of people just like me who couldn't get a job. And this guy comes out of an office, and he's laughing. He said, "Is there a Dan Walker in here?" I said, "Yes, sir." My military background showing right here. He said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Do you even know what a compensation manager is?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't have a clue." And he started laughing. He said, that's what I thought. He said, "You can't have that job. You don't know anything about it. You're not qualified for it. So no, that's a no for you. We won't even bother interviewing." I said, "Okay, sir, that's fine. Thank you for your time." He said, "Well, take a walk with me." And I said, okay. And I had no idea what was going on. So we're walking down the hallway. And back then in department stores, personnel departments, it was personnel then. Human resources hadn't been invented yet. And personnel departments were always in the sub basement for some reason. Mm-hmm. A subliminal message there, right? And so we're walking down the hallway, and he said, it's really funny. He said, "You have absolutely no background to do anything." He said, "But join the crowd because none of us do." He said, "I'm going to introduce you to a guy who I think is going to really like you, and you're going to like him." And so he takes me into this office, and he said, "I'd like to introduce you to Captain William Reffett." And he said, "Captain, this is Sergeant Walker." And so I shook his hand and sat down, and lo and behold, he was a West Point grad, 2 tours in Vietnam. He was an Army Ranger. And we started talking. And, after about 5 minutes, he said, "Danny, I really want you to come on board." He said, "This isn't like every place else." I said, "Yeah, that's what everybody says, Bill." He said, "No, I'm telling you." He said, "We've got a great group of people, and we really make a big difference. The vice chairman of the company actually used to run personnel here. And so this is an important operation." He said, "As a matter of fact, I want you to meet him." And so I find myself a few minutes later on the 6th floor, actually on the 7th floor. It was a floor above the last selling floor, being introduced to Tom Brown, whose brother was then the Attorney General, Bill Brown. And so we started chatting, and he obviously liked me as a person. He was very charming. I liked him as well. He said, "You're coming to work for me." I said, "Well, sir, first of all, I don't have an offer from you." And I said, "I'm not sure that I want to do this kind of work." He said, "Well, what do you think about the personnel people you've met so far, in all your interviews?" And I said, "They're pretty pathetic, sir." And it looks to me like they take
seems to be a lot of honesty going back and forth.
Yeah, I said, "It seems like it's a lot of folks who can't do real work, so they put them in this job." And he said, "That's not the way we do things." And so we chatted for a while. We wrapped it up, and he said, "Well, I'm going to make you an offer." And he said, "Do you think you might want to come on board?" And I said, "No, sir. You've been wonderful. Captain Reffett was terrific, but there's no way." So I go home, and as I'm walking into the door of the apartment, my wife is there on the phone, and I hear her saying, "Thank you, Mr. Brown. He'll be thrilled. I'm sure he's going to be happy about this. Thank you so much. And goodbye." I said, "What was that?" And she said, "Tom Brown was on the phone from Lazarus, and he just made you a job offer." And I thought, oh no, the jig is up. I'm caught. And I said, "Okay, how much am I making?" She said, $8,500 a year. Now, believe it or not, back then, that was a lot of money. And so that's how I started. And they threw me into the pit. And there was no training. There was a command sergeant major retired from the Army after 30 years who ran the employment office. So they tucked me under him. Roberto Das, born in Panama, veteran of 2 wars, shot so many times he had to retire. But he was incredible. God, I loved Bobby Doss. And he taught me how to do it right. And so I spent almost 10 years at Lazarus. After a couple of years, it became obvious that I could lead. And I really had started to enjoy what I was doing because we did it unlike anybody else back then. We really were a force in the company. We really drove the business of the business. And so I found myself at a very young age actually running the personnel department, or I should say the vast majority of the personnel department. There was one small piece that I didn't have. And I was a kid. So I'm 5 years into my career, and I find myself an officer of Federated Department Stores. And so that was really how I learned my trade. I learned it from a bunch of hard-nosed folks who took their job seriously, who took their mission seriously. And I was able to achieve in that environment, but we were always cutting against the grain. And so that's really how I got into the profession. And
so since those days, you've gone on to essentially, transform the way talent is managed, human resources is functioned, and I'm sure you've learned a lot in those course of the 10 years that took you down the path towards ultimately getting and being recruited into executive roles within Gap and then Apple and JCPenny beyond that. Tell us about that transition. I mean, what was it that you learned within Lazarus that you ultimately then took with you in subsequent environments and ultimately transformed the world of HR?
Well, we didn't take any of the traditional processes and concepts as gospel and for granted at Lazarus. I was taught from the very beginning, do what's right, do what makes the most sense. And since that fit my nature anyway, I mean, I was that way even in the military. Regardless of what the rules said, sometimes what I was able to piece together made a whole lot more sense. And I also wasn't afraid to try it, because the worst that could happen is that I could get my hands smacked and maybe, have an administrative hearing or something like that. And I was usually right because my instincts were good. Remember, I was a street kid. And so logic was very, very important to me. Logic and common sense. I guess I was blessed with that at birth. And throughout my years at Lazarus, and then in every ensuing job that I had, all I did was look for what made the most sense. First of all, I always looked for a challenge. I didn't want to do anything that was easy. And I wanted to take on something that was hairy and very complicated, something that other people would shy away from. Because to me, the fun was in diving into something that nobody thought was going to be able to happen or to be fixed or to be built, and to do my part in making it happen. So I went from Lazarus to General Mills, believe it or not. And that was at a time when all the big grain companies were trying to diversify. And they were buying retail companies, wholesale companies in the apparel industry, game companies, you name it. Quaker Oats, for instance, owned Brookstone, a retail store selling, tchotchkes. And so General Mills owned 6 retail specialty store companies, and a half a dozen wholesale fashion companies, and 2 game companies. And so one of my cohorts had gone there as a senior officer, and the chairman of Lazarus, who succeeded Charles Lazarus, a family member who retired, had gone there as the CEO of their retail group. And so I joined them, and it was in New York. So off we went to New York. And what we were attempting to do was to take all of these retail companies, and none of them actually, 2 were stable, 4 were teetering on the brink of extinction. And our goal was to recreate all 6 of them. And so I dove into it. I was the HR chief for that group. And so every one of those companies, and a couple that some of the listeners might remember, because some of them are gone, are the Talbots, the women's apparel business, and Eddie Bauer. Yeah, probably 2 of the most recognizable. And so we reinvented all of them. And after 3 years, it became apparent that General Mills was losing interest in their non-grain-based businesses. And we encouraged them to lose interest because we didn't think they had any business in that industry. So we attempted a management buyout. And, I was one of the 5 buyout principals. And in the 11th hour, 59th minute, almost literally, Chemical Bank was backing our play. And General Mills had also agreed to invest in the MBO. And in the 11th hour and 59th minute, and I won't go into any of the details because it's irrelevant, the deal fell through. When a deal falls through like that, there's no going back. They'd made the decision they were going to be out of the business, and we didn't get the business. We didn't get the companies. So what you do is you fall on your sword and move on. During my time during the last year, I had gotten a phone call from a friend who wanted me to meet this guy, Mickey Drexler, in California. And I had heard of Mickey before because Mickey was at Bloomingdale's as a merchant for Federated. And, he's very notorious as a great merchandiser. And he had been the president of Ann Taylor, did a very, very wonderful job there, and was recruited by the Fisher family, Don Fisher, to rebuild and reinvent the Gap in San Francisco, which had once been a powerhouse in kind of counterculture, blue jean business, the blue jean business. And but they had fallen on hard times because the world was changing, attitudes were changing, and fashion was changing. And so they hired Mickey to reinvent the business. And I met him at the Four Seasons Clift Hotel on Geary Street in San Francisco because he needed an HR chief. He hated human resources people, hated them with a passion. Actually, still does to this day, except for the ones that work for him. And
Why was that?
Well, he thought they were a bunch of do-nothings who knew nothing, and their job was to put up bureaucracy to get in your way of actually doing what's important. And that's not unusual, especially with very entrepreneurial, very highly driven senior execs. They love to hate the function.
I think that was also a part and parcel to the notion that the corporate culture back then was also very centered around shareholder value and the business operations of things and the people aspect of the business, even though it's in fad today and we understand it. But at that time, putting people front and center in terms of how that, influences and informs your culture could actually, dictate whether your business thrives or does not was
right.
A rather new notion back then.
Well,
right?
Actually not, because in the post-World War II years, all the way up well into the 70s, it really started to change at the end of the 70s. What the executives brought with them was a very crystal clear understanding that you succeeded or failed based upon your leaders and based upon how they led the rank and file. So you were no better than your leaders and the troops under their command. And that's what they learned. It was burned into them. So that when they came charging into American business, these were the folks who became the titans of these huge corporations. And they hired people who had been in the war as well. And they all had the same fundamental understanding. And so people mattered. People actually was the only thing that mattered. And what they would typically do is they would put their smartest, best executive in the personnel chief job. That was actually the training ground to become CEO. Believe it or not, that's the way it was back then. It was the most powerful function in any company. GE was built that way. A lot of the companies were built that way. And these were the same people who globalized American corporations. But it deteriorated as these people retired and as they passed it along to ensuing generations, it weakened. About every few years you'd have a weakening of it. So by the 80s, the bureaucrats had taken over and these incredible warriors were gone. I happen to have been trained by those people and I lived it myself. And so I was, I guess, old school in that regard. I'm actually a fundamentalist when it comes to the whole human resources personnel world. I love the basics. And
And
because
so, and so what would you say has fundamentally changed? Like if you look at today's environment in terms of the new startup world, the new environment with some of these younger companies coming up, I mean, what are, in your perspective, what are they doing right? What are they doing wrong?
well, they're all over the board, to be honest with you. I know a lot of these companies and these young folks, and I've been a part of some of them, and it's a mishmash. There's some who just instinctively get it. I think that the folks over at Netflix got it. Boy, they speak my language. Patty McCord, who was the HR chief over there, she got it from the beginning, and as did the founder. And I think they've done a wonderful job. I'm not going to name any companies or names, but there are a couple of emerging companies up in the Bay Area in technology, or let's just say in technology, because some of them aren't in the Bay Area, believe it or not, who instinctively get it, and they're doing the right things. They're building cultures where people are encouraged to take risks, where people are encouraged to have fun, encouraged to debate, and they put a real premium on people and on the quality of people and on the quality of their experiences there. It doesn't mean easy. It just means that they're there having fun, doing good work, and feeling rewarded for it. So they get it. So I'm not a total pessimist about it. I think the big guys are the ones who have lost their way, the big corporations, because the bureaucrats who moved in the 80s, who started creating these massive processes like organizational management resources review, manpower planning, succession planning, all this crap, these big bloated performance evaluation processes, none of them work. I know for a fact none of them work. They never worked for the ones who were ballyhooed as these halcyon, incredible concepts that drove the companies, like GE's resources review process that Jack Welch used to do on a regular basis. It was a joke. It was a joke. People hated it. They hid from it. They only produced the paper because they'd get in trouble if they didn't. And that became...
So when you entered Gap and Apple, did you face similar types of processes in those organizations?
Oh God! Especially,
I'll take that as a yes.
At Gap, it was horrific. They had all that stuff, and you know what I did? I just didn't pay attention to it. I just pretended like it didn't exist. And then that's the easiest way to extinguish something. I learned a long time. I learned in my psychology training, and I knew just instinctively that if there's bad behavior going on, if you just ignore it, it'll go away eventually. And so what I did was somebody would say, it's time to do such and such. I would say, well, why are we doing that? And they never could come up with an answer that made any sense to me. I'd say, well, we're not doing that anymore. And Mickey Drexler at Gap, he sure as hell didn't care, because what he wanted was more talent than he knew what to do with, because he was going to build the new Gap. And remember, this was when I got there, it was early 1986, very early 1986, and the company, he had just finally launched some product that was gaining traction, and that was after 3 years of struggling. And he had, I think it was, I want to say, a dozen successive quarters of declining sales as he reinvented the company. And he didn't cherish any of that old crap. And so what I did was I only did things that made sense. And none of it was stuff that anybody else thought was important. And I didn't do anything that everybody else thought was critical. So we didn't have succession planning. We didn't have, organizational reviews, where you look at the whole organization and go through this incredibly Machiavellian machination of trying to figure out, span of control and all that. None of that makes any sense. I only focused on great leaders and a never-ending supply of great talent that they could mold into a great fighting force, a workforce.
I love how everything, the common theme behind everything that you've done is something that you mentioned earlier on was, there's no fear in doing the right thing. And I find this very interesting in the context of your military background, because military is very much grounded in rules and hierarchical order, and following set guidelines in order to make it function. But on the flip side, you tend to do things that are very unorthodox and disruptive. But at the end of the day, it's not really looking at it whether it's following the rules or unorthodox. It's doing what's actually right.
Actually, Dr. G, I have to correct you on that. Okay, the military is the majority of the military, especially the tip of the spear part of it, the fighting part of it, always has been asymmetrical in their approach. Because you've heard the old stories about the best plan. You can have the greatest plan in the world until the first shot's fired, then everything goes to hell. And and if the lieutenant gets shot, guess what? The sergeant steps up. The sergeant gets shot, the corporal steps up. So everybody leads, and you improvise on the fly all the time because nothing goes the way you plan. So it's the best training in the world is to be in any kind of fighting unit in the military, because they do everything in an asymmetrical fashion. And that's the way our whole U.S. Special Forces model has been created. I mean, these are highly evolved, creative thinkers who are able to, no matter what happens, adjust and accomplish the mission in grand style. And so they're better by far than corporate America. Far better. They're more evolved as leaders, and their human concepts, their people concepts, are far more sophisticated. And it's not hierarchical at all. It's only the back end that's hierarchical. Look at people like Stanley McChrystal. He never met a rule that he didn't want to break. Okay, these people, the real war fighters, are incredible. And so I, had the advantage of, serving under people like that and doing that kind of work. And, so there is a huge reason why those kind of models should be looked at in American business today. So I guess, that's something you couldn't erase from my background because, I spent some very formative years in the military.
I mean, I find that absolutely fascinating. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe, when you transitioned and, moved over to Apple, that was a common connection that Steve Jobs was fascinated with as well. That you two had really discussed a lot of the military sort of way of doing things and rearing leaders was something that you
Steve was a hippie. He was a commune hippie. I mean, everybody knows the story of Steve, so I'm not going to go into that. And he was indeed all those things. And he wasn't much of a military guy at all. I don't even know what he thought about the military. But I do know that we were faced with some massive, massive challenges because Steve had come back and had decided to become the CEO and preside over a company that had been destroyed.
This is at a time where the second coming of Apple is on the brink of bankruptcy.
He came back in 97. And the only reason the company wasn't gone was because Fred Anderson, the CFO, was able to manage the cash of the business and divest some of the assets. And he managed it into survival. And so it was still alive when Steve got there, because Steve came back on the board. He wasn't in charge, and finally they convinced him to become the interim CEO. That was in 97. And so he, actually, if I recall, he was still the interim CEO when I got there. And actually, he used to have the office that I had, which was 30 feet from him. There were four people who sat in a little area on the fourth floor of Infinite Loop 1, which is the Valhalla of Apple. That's where Steve resided. We were on the other end of the flying bridge. It was heaven, right? Not. And so there was Steve, Fred Anderson, the CFO, me, and Tim Cook around the corner. Mm-hmm. And that was the group. And I remember
Tim was in operations at that time?
Yep, Tim was in operations. He was running the supply chain. And so we were faced with this. Of course, we had the meltdown in 2000. Just our stock dropped from 130 something to that's in pre-split. They split 2 for 1 and 4 for 1 since then. So you can put it in perspective. We had just dropped from 137 to 9.25 a share, and we couldn't give away a computer. I mean, we could have parked a truck in any urban area, high crime area in the country full of Mac products, and they wouldn't have even busted the seal. So we couldn't give away product. It was apparent that we were either going to have to figure a way to claw our way out and break out, or we were going to die again. And Steve only had about 1.5 years of high flying after he came back, after he simplified, down to 4 products basically. And they were doing really well. And, the iMac came out, and that was a huge success. And, the PowerBooks. And then all hell broke loose, at the end of 2000, with the crash in 2000. Mm-hmm. And, the whole valley was destroyed, as was most of the American economy. And so we luckily had $2.2 billion in cash reserves. And we decided that we were going to, we made some very critical decisions. I still remember this, and it was driven, actually, in the evenings, it would usually be Steve, Fred, and me, because I was commuting from Southern California. So I didn't have a life. I lived in an apartment, and my whole life up there was Apple. Steve was trying to keep the company alive. Fred didn't have any kids, so he was in there trying to save the company every night. So we'd end up in Fred's office because the CFO, because Steve didn't like having anybody in his office, and it was a pig pen anyway. And Fred and he didn't like sitting in conference rooms, when he was doing casual conversation. And he hated my office because I had a round table. And he thought that was pretentious. And he thought it was stupid. And I told him, well, great. I don't give a shit what you think. I'm going to keep my round table. So Fred had a sofa and a love seat and a coffee table. So that's where we would end up. And I remember one night we were sitting there with our hands hanging down over our knees, like rejected teenagers after they had just asked their girls to the prom, and morose. And so Steve said, "What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? How are we going to fix this?" And so Fred mumbled something. I can't even remember what it was. And I said, "Don't look at me. I just got here. I helped you I helped you put the retail concept together, but, I don't have any ideas." And he said, "Well, we've got to come up with a strategy. Doing nothing isn't an option." So we go round and round and round. And finally, Steve, after an hour of going around and around, he said, "Okay, why don't we decide what we're not going to do? Because if we don't know what to do, maybe we can decide what not to do." Mm-hmm. And so we sat there for the next, 15, 20, 30 minutes, and we decided 5 things that we were not going to do. And looking back historically, those 5 decisions of what not to do ensured that we would not only survive, but be able to break out. And
do you recall what those 5 were?
Oh, I lived it. One was we would not touch a penny of that $2.2 billion that we had in the bank. It was the only thing that separated us from absolute destruction. So we wouldn't take any of our cash out. The other one was that we would not pull back on retail, because the future of Apple was going to be retail. That if we couldn't tell our story directly to the customers, as opposed to going through a teenager at CompUSA, then we were doomed, because Apple was a premium product with a story. We decided that we were not going to pull back on development of a new operating system, because we had an antiquated operating system that we couldn't build a future on. And we were well into developing it, but there was still a lot more money to be spent. So we decided that was going to move forward. We decided that we were going to move forward on the development of applications, because we had just established a new applications division, because we were dependent upon Microsoft and Adobe and a number of others to do all of our apps. We only had a couple of apps at that point in time. We weren't in the apps business. And the other one was we decided that we were not going to do layoffs. We were not going to do mass layoffs because everybody was doing mass layoffs. Sun Microsystem, Cisco, Intel, you name it. They were tens of thousands of people. And he said that would destroy, the whole fabric of the company. But we knew we had to get our burn rate down because with our sales forecast dramatically decreased, and we were forecasting, 40%, 50% drops in sales. We had to drop our burn rate. And so, Fred and I still, even to this day, won't go into incredible detail. We figured a way to reduce our head count dramatically and our labor cost burn rate, but increase the quality of the organization infinitely. And I remember Steve was walking by one evening because he had to pass my door to go out of the area where we worked. And we were chatting, and I said, Steve, there's a concept that the military uses, the special forces uses, like the Navy SEALs and Delta Force, all these guys. It's called force multiplication. One SEAL should be able to have the fighting effectiveness of 100 of their enemy. So if you've got 10 Navy SEALs, they should be able to take on a battalion of their enemies. And they've got to be the best in the world, and they've got to be properly equipped and supported. They got to be the best of the best of the best. I said, so we need to force multiply. We need to take out 10 and replace those 10 with one who can do the work of 100. Or we need to find that one that we've got and make sure that they're supported and that they know how important they are, and they will do the work of 100. And so what we did was over the course of a couple of years, we pruned our workforce, and we got it down to the best of the best that we already had, and we supplemented with more of the best of the best. So we were going for all stars. Why would you not? I never understood bell curves. I don't get bell curves when it comes to people. Why would you ever plan to have average people or terrible people? Why not just have all great people? Who says you can't do that? And so that was really our objective. And that really became the foundation of the human resources operation at Apple. We had a very simple mission. HR organizations, I love asking HR chiefs, hey, what's your mission? Why do you exist? And it takes, anywhere from 5 minutes to a half hour for them to get something out. And I can never understand what they're talking about. And I like those one sentence blasts that you go, wow, I get it. Okay. That's crystal clear. And so we did that. And our mission was very simple. It was to supply the company with an overabundance of extraordinary talent to drive any enterprise that we should choose to pursue. In other words, overabundance was critical. Extraordinary was critical, and being able to shift on the fly to chase any business was very important. So we became a supply chain operation. We became a line operation, which I think is what HR really is, done well. It's a supply chain. You're in the product development, manufacturing, and distribution business.
I'd imagine a lot of other organizations, in theory, believed that they were actually doing that. So what separated your ability to execute on force multiplication?
Actually, they didn't believe that. You'd be surprised. No, even some of the terminology, we even created new language that didn't exist before 2000. And the language was built, new human resources language. It was actually, first of all, I got rid of the concept of human resources. I was the chief talent officer at Apple. And I think I was the first one to ever use that title. I'm sure I am. And I made it up because that was our product. Okay. Talent was our product, period. And so we started changing the language. I just started using different language. And my folks would get really frustrated because they'd start talking in human resource lingo. And I'd say, I don't understand what you're talking about. Speak English to me. So we invented terms like, believe it or not, talent acquisition. Do you know that didn't exist before 2000?
Wow.
And
no idea.
If it did, it might be, in some, deeply buried paper someplace that came out of Cornell. Who knows? But it wasn't the language of the land. And so talent supply chain, those kind of terms weren't used when it came to talent because they were looking more at the administrative stuff being the most important things in their business. You'd be surprised, and even to this day, how administratively centered HR organizations are in very big companies. Now that's shifting. I don't think it's shifting smoothly because I don't see most companies being incredibly talented at really making talent the foundation of their business. And you can actually see it in the lack of performance in companies. And they're so big today that it hides an awful lot of inefficiencies. And you look at the breakout players in Silicon Valley today, the ones who are really doing well, and they have visionary leaders who really believe in talent. They get it instinctively. The guy who created Airbnb, Airbnb is a great company. I think they've done a wonderful job. Mm-hmm. And it's going to last. And, this kid, Evan Spiegel up at Snapchat, okay, he knows that his engineering force is the difference between greatness and failure. And, I hear he can be kind of a jerk, but Steve could be kind of a jerk, and Mickey was kind of a jerk too. But, focused on talent, focused on quality, focused on product. But, invariably, these are usually people who also, from a human point of view, do the right thing. They have pretty damn good values. Mm. Steve and Mickey, for as crazy as they could get and emotional and even to the point of yelling and screaming, you know what? They were good people. They had good fundamental values and principles. And so, you can be tough and ornery and yell a lot and still be incredibly capable. And I don't see, there's not enough of that going on in corporate America today. I just see a lot of methodical plotting. And I see an awful lot of a big, bloated processes. I mean, why they cling to, I can't remember which one of the big accounting firms announced that they were going to abandon the performance review, the annual performance review. Good for them. They should have done it a long time ago. It never made any sense for anybody. I completely eradicated it when I was at Apple. I got rid of it in 2000 because I couldn't see any purpose in doing it because all it did was create harm. Why would you do something year after year that shut the company down for weeks and made everybody angry and produced nothing but heartache? No positive ever came out of it. Why would you do it?
I've personally never seen the value of that in the course of my career.
It's destructive. It's completely destructive. And so I remember I was in a room with my direct reports, and it was that time where they were discussing, how we were going to do the next performance review cycle, which was coming up in a few months. And they got into this insane argument about, when should they send them out? Because the last time it took 8 weeks to get them all back in, as opposed to the 3 that they'd expected. So everybody was late because they were reviewing every single one of them, which I think is insulting to a line manager. And then what really got me was they got into this argument about, okay, in the choices, in terms of how well a person does or how poorly a person does something, how many boxes is the right number of boxes? And they got into this argument as to whether 3 or 4 or 5 choices, all the way from terrible to incredible. whatever the range is, whatever words you want to use. I'm sitting there. I'm not saying a word. 30 minutes they go on. And I just asked a question. I said, so you go through this every year. I would assume that after it's all over and you finally get all the reviews in and all the people get talked to and they get their raises and all that kind of stuff, there must be this spurt of performance in this company that is incredible, must blow your socks off, because all this incredible process just unfolded to really drive performance and drive engagement and excitement. And I said, does that happen every year? If I look at the numbers, can I see that surge every year? They said, well, no, it's not really the way it works. I said, well, why would you do this? This is the dumbest thing that American companies do. I can't think of anything dumber that they do.
It's just the way things have been done. It's like
That's right.
Phrase that goes, no one's ever been fired for hiring IBM, right?
Yep, that's exactly right. And so I said, we're not doing it. They said, what do you mean we're not doing it? I said, we're not going to do it anymore. Okay? We're not doing it. Yeah. And they said, well, don't you have to have a meeting and all that? I said, no. I'm the chief talent officer. Do you know how the pyramid works? I'm sitting at the top. Okay. I get to make these kind of decisions. Do you think Steve is going to fight me on this and he's going to fight to have them? He hates them. He never does them for his people. And I said, do you think any of our executive team is going to fight me on this? I don't need to have a meeting. What I am going to do is I'm going to go visit each one of them individually. And I'm going to tell them, okay, look, you don't have to do these anymore, ever. And as a matter of fact, I'm killing all the other stuff too. Everything that gets in your way, that's bureaucratic, that doesn't yield anything. And so I said, but here's the deal. Here's what you got to do. You have to commit to having the absolute best leaders that you can possibly have. And great leaders are teachers, number one. And they're also guides for their people. They exist to support their people in their efforts to do their very best work. And if you don't have those leaders, you're dead. And they've got to talk to their people on a regular basis. This is something that's like breathing for them, 24/7, all year long, every year.
So many great lessons embedded in there.
And I told them, I said, if it doesn't happen, then you are going to be papered like you've never been papered before. And but as long as you can you adhere to these basic values and concepts? They said, absolutely, it makes sense. We should have been doing that all along. I said, great, we agree. So do we have a deal? They said, yes. I said, okay, I'm going to hold you to it, because if you don't do it, then you're going to get punished.
Back to simplicity. I love it. I'd imagine that you could probably write a book I know you could write a book of the number of stories that you've experienced in your time across Apple and the other organizations as well.
Honestly, Dr. G, no interest. I've tried to preach the gospel, everywhere I've been, and I've had a lot of disciples, people who work for me, who went on to carry it with them to other places. I don't really, I don't have the desire to do that. But
you pass it on. You pass it on through amazing stories, and I know that Steve Jobs has been written about ad nauseum in many textbooks, and that's probably a lot most will ever be able to encounter. But you've actually had a front row seat, and I know there's dozens and dozens of stories that you've probably encountered with Steve. I mean, what would you think, thinking back, and your experience with, getting iPod off the ground and the Apple retail store, and a number of other transformational products and services that you guys deployed. And what was your most memorable and unusual moment with Steve Jobs that no one else really would understand?
Oh my God, that's a tough one. Everything he did was memorable. So this is very difficult for me. But I remember, and this is actually what caused me to create the mission statement that we had. Really, forget mission statement. That's too bureaucratic. Our mission. I was going to hire a woman by the name of Patty Shue, who was a merchandiser from, she was at Gap. I hired her when she was young at the Gap as a merchant. And she was at Williams-Sonoma as one of their top merchandisers. And I wanted to hire her to actually run my talent acquisition operation, for my rank and file, for the bulk of the company. Outside of retail and our senior officers, she was going to be the talent acquisition chief for everything else that we did. Mm-hmm. But she was a merchant. She knew how to develop product. She knew how to source it. She knew how to run an inventory and run a supply chain. And so Patty was in my office. I was talking to her, trying to convince her to take this job, to leave her job at Williams-Sonoma. And so she's leaving the office. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, Steve had to walk by my office from his door to get out the back door because he liked to take the back door out. And he hated going through the lobby. And so as he's cutting around the corner, and Steve always looked at the ground and walked on his toes, which is something, by the way, that I know most of the brilliant engineers I've ever run into, had that characteristic. He's thinking, right? He's solving some problem in his head. He's not looking at where he's going. And as she walks out of the door, boom, they run into each other physically. And he looked at her, and Steve had no tact whatsoever in terms of interpersonal contact. He said, "Who are you?" Just like that, no preamble. He didn't. "Who are you?" She said, "My name's Patty Shue." He said, "Well, what are you doing here? Why are you here to see Dan?" And she said, "He made me a job offer." He said, "To do what?" And that's the way Steve talked, right? And she said, I'm gonna run talent. I'm gonna do the hiring for the company, especially for the engineering group and the product marketing groups and those kind of folks, all the folks that we hire here in Cupertino. And he said, "Oh," he said, that's a big job." And she said, "It is." He said, "Are you going to do it?" She said, "Well, I don't know. Probably not." And she said, "Let me ask you a question." She said, "What do you want out of Dan, out of his operation? I mean, what do you want? What do you want him to do? What do you want this function to do?" He said, "God forbid I would ever have more incredible talent that I knew what to do with. That would be heaven for me." That's exactly what he said. Wow. So that, did I need to look any further than what he said? That was the CEO and the co-founder of the company. Yeah. He said it. I didn't need to go any further than that. I was simply just going to do what he said. And he put it into very simple words. And that became our mission. Wow. Period. And so, that was classic. That was classic Steve. He could be ornery as can be, but you know what? He always succumbed to logic. And he would argue from emotion and logic. You couldn't argue back with him with emotion, but you could always argue with logic. He always respected common sense. And it's funny, Steve never thought I was an HR guy. Actually, he knew how much I despised the concept of it, as it's traditionally practiced. Mm-hmm. And so he just never thought I was an HR guy. He probably wouldn't have wanted me to come on board if he thought that. And I will never forget, we had something that happened. I was in Singapore at the time. So it was a classic HR kind of a thing. It was a big, messy problem. I won't go into any details about what it was. So he had the general counsel handle it. And he called me up and he said, "This happened." And I said, "Yeah, I heard about it." And he said, "I'm going to have so-and-so handle it." I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, because, it's just HR stuff." He said, "I know you don't like to get involved in that stuff." And what he didn't know was behind the scenes, all the other, the bread had to get baked, the potato salad had to get made every day. And we were running our deli every day. All he saw was that incredible showcase of goodies. And he didn't see the sausage being made in the back. But that's good, because I didn't want him to even think that we did that.
I love it. I could sit and listen to your stories all day, all day long.
And actually, to fortify what, the way he was thinking, I I never thought that benefits and administration belonged in human resources. It's a dumb place to put it because they never have the systems or the administrative expertise to do it right. And so I cut a deal with our CFO, with Fred Anderson, to send it over to him because I was always fighting for funding and IT support for all this stuff. I just said, Fred, I want to give it to the treasurer because he also runs risk management. And then we'll create a committee of 5 people and we will decide strategy. We will look at strategic plans for this stuff and we will make the decision. But I get 2 votes. He said, I'm fine with that. and that's what we did. And so I said, I sent it packing over to the treasurer. Never missed it.
Love it. Well, I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. And I don't know where time has gone, but we still haven't even touched upon your transition over to JCPenny, and a number of other stories are embedded within here. So perhaps we may have to do a second show where we can touch on some of those topics. But I know you're an individual who can't.
Or maybe Dr.G, it's not even worth telling because
it's definitely, knowing you, it's definitely worth telling.
But most of what you'd want to know about me, or if you cared at all, is baked into most of what I just said.
That's great. So what's next for Dan Walker? What's your next chapter?
Getting my twins off to college. That's the last of the kids. I'm enjoying being kind of the old guy. I just turned 66. I have no desire to go run anything. I don't want to change. I don't want to go out and change the world. And I have done my share of fighting over almost 7 decades. And what I want to do is just get involved in things that I find intriguing, fascinating, and challenging on a peripheral basis. I don't want to be the big cheese on anything. And I've got a couple of new concepts that I'm baking because I've been an entrepreneur twice and I just can't get it out of my system. And so I'm working on 2 of them now. And one will probably launch next year and another one in 2018. But I'm not going to run either of them. And
can you tell us anything about those?
One I can. One is a leadership development platform that I've already tested using the leadership development principles that are baked into the creation and development of our special operations forces in the U.S., particularly, and other elite military organizations in the U.S. So it's how SEAL leaders are built. It's how Delta Force leaders are built. It's how Apache attack helicopter commanders are built. It's how submarine captains are built. It's how elite jet fighter squadron commanders and even their junior officers are built. And they all use the same techniques and practices. And if you boil it down, the language might be different, but the fundamental premises are all the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and put it into terms that anybody in any company can understand. Men, women. It's not a macho, crawl through the weeds, put camouflage on your face kind of a thing. It's actually, they're very sophisticated in their approach. And it's going to be taught by these elite military leaders. And we're going to launch that sometime next year. And I've got 3 just incredible partners. One was the former executive officer for all of the Navy SEALs. The other one was a naval base commander. And he was also the head of Top Gun, the Navy's pinnacle flight training school. And another one was he went to the Naval Academy and then was a SEAL team officer for 6 years. And then he worked at Apple for 10 years. So he's a nice hybrid of the 2 worlds. Those 3 guys are going to launch it.
Well, it sounds like an amazing initiative. I can't wait till we hear of the launch of that.
We don't have grand plans. All of them have day jobs. And so we're going to launch it slowly and organically. We're not taking anybody's money. And I already have places that already want to do this. I've tried this model. Actually, it was baked into the Apple leadership model because it came out of my head. And the one that still is done today, that actually had all these concepts baked into it. And so, and I did this at JCPenny right before they turned the lights out on us. And it was developed with 2 Delta Force operators, the top Delta Force operators. And we did our pilot run. And the results were nothing short of astounding.
I'm sure.
And the people who went through it felt transformed. And I know for a fact that it's lasted well beyond their training, and it's affected them for life. So that's something I'd like to see come to life.
That sounds great.
And I'm also writing 2 books. And I'm not going to say anything about them because I know everybody's writing books.
I thought you said you weren't going to be writing any books.
I'm not writing the book you mentioned.
Oh, okay.
But
fair enough.
But I am in the process of writing. You know,
we'll have you back on the show to learn a bit more about that.
Okay, that sounds good.
We have, Dan, I like to close out the podcast with sort of a series of canned questions. It's kind of a rapid fire Mad Libs, kind of questions. Or less so questions, more so statements where I'll start off a sentence and you fill in the blank. And it's just meant to be fun and spontaneous and just, answer whatever comes first to mind. So if you don't mind, we'll get started. There's just 5 questions here.
Shoot, go for it.
The first one's the best piece of advice I ever received was...
from Bobby Doss, the guy who trained me at Apple. I said to him, okay, Sergeant Major, that was his title in the Army. I said, so where are the books and is there any training I need to do this work? And he turned me around, and I'm looking out at a sea of faces looking for jobs. This was in a basement of a department store, and there were about 400 or 500 people out there applying for jobs. He said, "You see all those people?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "They all want jobs here." And he said, "There are probably 400 people out there." He said, "Only 2 are worth hiring." And he said, "Get your ass up there to the counter," because we had to interview standing up at a counter. It was like a fast food restaurant. And he said, "Go figure out how to get rid of the other 498. So, it was just a cut through the crap, get to the point.
That's great. All right, next question. The one unusual habit that I do on a daily basis is?
Unusual habit. You know what I do? This is sharing something actually very private. The biggest influence on my life was my mother, who, bless her heart, died in the 80s at the age of 75. And I sit down every day and think about her. I take 5 minutes out of the day, and I just sit and remember.
That's powerful. What a wonderful tribute to your mother on that. Thank you for sharing that, Dan.
Thank you.
Next question, and this is a little bit of a tough one. If I had to write a book about myself, the title of the book would be?
Unbroken. And I realized it was a movie. But here I am at 66, still alive, actually against the odds, because both my father and his father and my father's brothers all died in their 50s.
Wow.
And I was a poor kid, who made it. And, I never lost myself in the process. I'm still the same kid, who in the 5th grade worked his rear end off only because it made me feel good. And I felt it was the right thing to do. I've always worked like a dog.
I think that certainly reflects you very well. I would add one more word to it. I'd say unbroken and thriving, or unbroken and against the odds.
Definitely against the odds, because most of the fights that I got into, most of the jobs I had, I call them fights. Almost all of them were against the odds. The odds were stacked against me. Everybody would say to me, "Why are you doing that? You're nuts." But that was my fuel.
Okay, next question. If you could invite 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, who would you invite and what would you talk about?
Oh God, I'd have to have Steve back. I miss him so much. And everybody who worked had any closeness with him at all. They do. I would probably want to talk to Patton. And I think Patton would get along with Steve. Steve would like him. And believe it or not, Shakespeare.
Wow.
I just absolutely find so much beauty in what Shakespeare produced.
That's a great mix of folks at the table. I would love to be a fly on the wall there.
That would be a lively dinner conversation, wouldn't it?
It sure would. Absolutely. And adding you into the mix of it, that would be
there'd be a lot of profanity at the table, except for Bill.
Okay, last question, and then we'll do a wrap. I'm unusual because
I'm not. I'm actually
you don't
not.
Think you are?
No, I think there are a lot of people like me. I really do. I at 66, I'm still very optimistic. I meet people all the time who I just admire the daylights out of them. In all walks of life, at all levels. There's a guy who runs a tire store here in San Clemente, Ron. I'd love to be more like him. And, we're blessed, especially in this country. We like to beat ourselves up, and the press loves to beat us up, and everybody beats us up. The world beats us up. But this country is filled with amazing people.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. Fascinating people all around us, not just
Absolutely.
In the headlines and in the top echelon, but in our everyday surroundings. I couldn't agree with you more.
There's not a day goes by that I don't meet, a bunch of them. And it keeps me enthused about the human race and especially about our country and our people. Despite all the craziness that's going on, I still fundamentally think this is an incredible country filled with incredible people. And we lose our way occasionally, but we always get back on course.
Like, I can't think of a better sentiment to wrap up the show with that.
Hi again, it's me, Dr. G. If you are still listening, I'm hoping it's because you enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to hear future episodes, you could really help me out by subscribing to the That's Unusual podcast on iTunes and leaving a review. It goes a long way in helping me get the word out from avid listeners like you. As a thank you, I will be selecting one new reviewer each week at random for a free private 15-minute phone conversation where you can ask me anything and get professional advice on your career or business to help you stand out and make a difference. Also, if you want to be notified of any future episodes, please visit that'sunusualpodcast.com and sign up to receive updates on new episode releases. Until next time, remember to always think unusual.